Okay, this is part 2 about classic books that are fun and painless to read. Sorry about breaking this into parts. I've got a camera that has a 30-minute time limit, so that's my time limit for rambling. But I've got a few more books to talk to, and when I got cut off last time, I wasn't finished about talking about Peter Pan. So I really like this book as a 6th grader. I read it again about 8 years ago, and I did it by audiobook, but it still counts. And when I did it by audiobook, I found it so funny, and I didn't remember it being so funny as a kid. Maybe some of this ironic humor just went over my head a bit, I don't know. But there's just so much sarcastic and ironic humor in this Peter Pan book. It reminds me a little bit of kind of Douglas Adams, where he's kind of satirizing the genre. That kind of, like the voice of the narrator will kind of come out to kind of tell you like all the ridiculous things that are going on. So you have like the characters doing what they're doing, and then you have the voice of the narrator kind of making sarcastic comments on what the characters are doing. Kind of, maybe this is stretching a little bit, but kind of reminded me of Douglas Adams in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. For example, like the Mr. Darling acts like kind of more of a child than his children do, and kind of gets in fits and temper tantrums. I just found those parts of the book really funny. And then when they get to the Never Never Land, Captain Hook is just a real funny character. He's like, as you find out more and more about the character, you find out that before he was a pirate, he went to an upper class boarding school in England. And so he's just obsessed with this idea of kind of good form and kind of being respected. So on the one hand, like, he's a bloodthirsty pirate. On the other hand, he's got this public school boarding voice. Public school in the English sense refers to kind of a prestigious school. I know it's backwards from the American usage. So like, yeah, he's got this public school voice in the back of his head, kind of asking him what he's really accomplished, and kind of so obsessed with getting good form. I don't know, there's just a lot of really funny parts in the book that I think as a kid, I took them at face value, and I didn't realize they were meant to be ironic or sarcastic. It's just a really funny book. Although, I do say that with kind of one note of caution. George Orwell, who I really like. Orwell is one of those authors that I really love, but he doesn't make this list because he's after World War I. But I was reading a book of Orwell's essays a few years ago, and a few times in this collection of essays, Orwell, whenever he wants to reference an example of a bad book that kind of popular people like but is really terrible, he references Peter Pan as his example. And so, like, Orwell's somebody I trust a lot in terms of their judgment. So then I thought, oh right, maybe I had it all wrong if Orwell doesn't like this book. But then, I don't know, maybe Orwell can be wrong every now and again. Or maybe Orwell was just kind of too close in time to this book. You know, maybe, because I think some of these books, classic children's books, kind of only become classics with the next generation, right? Like, if you're already 30 when Harry Potter comes out, you can never appreciate it. But if you are like born 10 years after Harry Potter comes out, then like it's already a classic book to you, and then by the time you get old, you present it to your kids as a classic. Maybe that's what happened with Peter Pan. People who are already adults when Peter Pan came out just could never appreciate it. How old was Orwell in 1905? I don't remember. Maybe I don't know. Moving on. Oh, right. Sorry. Another fun thing about Peter Pan. I just mentioned in the previous video, earlier books on this list, how much I liked Treasure Island. J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, was also good friends with Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Treasure Island. And J.M. Barrie was a huge fan of Treasure Island, so he worked in a few different references to Treasure Island in Peter Pan. So you get references to Barbecue, which was Long John Silver's nickname. You get references to Captain Flint and the Walrus, which was Captain Flint's ship. So it's kind of fun to imagine that Treasure Island and Peter Pan kind of take place in the same universe, even though the genres are completely different. Like Peter Pan is like a magical book with fairies and stuff like that. Treasure Island is kind of mythical in its own way, but more or less in the real world. I don't know, I just find those connections kind of neat between the two books. Okay. Moving on, The Time Machine. Now, I was talking earlier about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I said this is one of those books that's kind of spoiled right from the first page because the modern reader already knows the twist. I think The Time Machine by H.G. Wells is also kind of in that category. There's a really great twist in this book. In fact, the whole book is kind of building up to a couple of great twists. And I'm a little worried that everyone knows what these twists are before they read it. I kind of did because I read an abridged version as a kid, although when I was reading the abridged version, I didn't know what the twist was going to be, so maybe that counts. But as an adult, I want to say don't read any spoilers, just go into this book completely blind. And if you can do that, just go into this book completely blind. It's a little bit difficult though because the publisher always spoils it. Like the front cover or the back cover will just show a picture or something that will give away the twist. It's terrible. If you can find a copy of this book that has like no covers on it or like no spoilers on the cover, and if you can go into this book completely blind, oh, what a great story. Some great twists. You have a treat kind of waiting ahead of you. And because I don't want to spoil anything, I'm not going to say a lot about this book except to say, boy, when you read this book, and I read it as an adult, having already read an abridged version as a kid, so I knew the twist was coming, but just kind of the way the author layers on the suspense and layers on the mystery, and just kind of builds and builds, and like, it's just like a classic, creepy sci-fi story. And it's so modern when you read it. And it was written all the way back in 1895. But it just reads like a modern, classic, Twilight Zone-esque type story. Oh, it's just great. Highly recommended it. Other books by H.G. Wells, which I enjoyed, but when it didn't quite make this list. The War of the Worlds was good, but I don't know. To me, maybe this is because by the time we get to now in 2018, the idea of Martians invading Earth has just been done so many times that it's beginning to get a bit boring. I think when H.G. Wells first wrote War of the Worlds in 1890s, maybe it was a lot fresher of an idea by then. But it's just, I don't know. You're just kind of plodding through the inevitable beats of a story that you already know so well. The Martians land, they're mysterious, people don't know what's going to happen. Then they kind of come up, they start attacking people. They send the military against the Martians obliterate the military. And you just kind of, all this stuff is going to happen. So you're just kind of slogging through the beats of a story that you know. There are some really great parts kind of in the middle when they're hiding in that house. I shouldn't give this part away. There are some great parts in the middle, but on the whole, I didn't find the story held up that well to a modern audience. Invisible Man, I read this way back when I was like in 7th grade. I don't remember it terribly well. Maybe I'm due for a reread on it. I remember it being a bit slow as a kid. Island of Dr. Moreau, I read that when I was 18. I actually kind of like that. Actually, maybe that should make this list. I don't remember it well enough. But I remember it being readable enough. Yeah, maybe The Island of Dr. Moreau could make this list as well. Okay. Arsène Lupin. Now, as with Sherlock Holmes, this is another book where I'm kind of cheating because a lot of the books in the Arsène Lupin collection came after World War I, but some of them predate World War I, so I'm kind of sneaking the whole collection in because some of the stories, the very first stories, came before World War I. This is a collection of stories here. It's like Sherlock Holmes, there's not just one story, it's a whole collection of stories. It's about a master thief who kind of, sometimes he's a thief, but sometimes he acts as a detective to try and help people out. So in that respect, it's kind of like Sherlock Holmes, except it's a lot more bizarre. And the character is arguably more interesting because he's more amoral. No, he's not amoral. He has his own code of ethics. But he's also like a thief, so he can be against the law sometimes. The stories are a bit more bizarre than the Sherlock Holmes stories, but that's part of the fun as well. So it's kind of, again, it's another kind of pulp fiction book that I'm sneaking in just because it's old. But that's the criteria. Anything before 1914. So it can be a lot of fun. Okay. The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. Why am I doing this book last? I should have put this book at the beginning, because this is like the ultimate example of a classic book, which is just so fun to read. I should have started with this. Apologies for putting this at the end. Although, maybe it's best to finish off with the best example. Three Musketeers is just, I'm reading it, and I'm thinking, this is a classic? This is like an airplane novel, and I mean that in a good way. It's just like a thriller that you would get off the airplane bookstore, where it just starts off with a bang, and then it just never lets up. Like in a good way. The pacing is just so great. They just kind of run from one adventure to another. There's no long, boring descriptions. The whole thing is just intrigue and adventure, and I really felt like I was cheating, because I felt like I was getting away with something, because it's a classic book. So like, it's one of those books that you can go back to your high school English teacher and brag about having read. You're like, I've been reading the classics, but like, it doesn't feel like a classic. It just feels like a great adventure story. Highly recommend Three Musketeers. The politics of the book are a little bit problematic. I didn't like the politics so much, but in terms of the story, I just love the story of it so much. Now, Three Musketeers actually has a lot of sequels. 20 years after, which I've got right here. And then there's a third book in the series, which in the original French, I think is 1 volume, but in the English translation, it's 4 volumes. So continuing, depending on how you count it, there's like 6 books maybe in the English-speaking world in the Three Musketeers series. I felt, this is just my personal opinion, I felt that the first book, The Three Musketeers, is a lot of fun. 20 years after was a little bit slower pace, but still pretty fun. And then with kind of each book after that, I felt the pacing got slower and slower, until by the time I got to the end of the series, I was losing my patience with it a little bit. So, yeah. So I can't put all the rest of the books in the Three Musketeers series in the category of fun and painless. But that original book, boy, wow, what a great read. Another book by the same author, The Count of Monte Cristo, same author. You can see he doesn't write short books. These are long books. Yeah, this book as well, it doesn't quite make the list of fun and painless. The beginning of the book is great. The ending of the book is great. But the middle of the book is just kind of slow and meandering and goes on all these pointless digressions. The middle of the book is a slog. I hate to say it. So The Count of Monte Cristo doesn't quite make the list of fun and painless. But The Three Musketeers definitely. Okay. Now, I'm going to get into my three main Bs on the list here. War and Peace, The Age of Reason, and the Iliad, and I'll explain why they're maybes. First of all, War and Peace. I really liked War and Peace, and I think arguably it fits my definition for fun and painless, but okay. But there's some debate, and I'll explain what the debate is. War and Peace is really a great book, and I think it gets somewhat of a bad rap. You know, people all the time, they say, oh, I hate Russian literature. It's so boring and long and boring. And what they're really talking about is they're talking about Dostoevsky. They're not talking about Tolstoy. They think they're talking about Tolstoy, but they're not. They've picked up like the Brothers Karamazov or Crime and Punishment and these long kind of philosophical books by Dostoevsky. Crime and Punishment especially, where there's like a little bit of plot at the beginning and there's a plot at the end, and then the middle is just all these philosophical discussions. Brothers Karamazov I actually read relatively recently, a couple years ago. So it was after I started doing YouTube videos, so I've actually reviewed it on this channel. I'll link to it below or something like that. Brothers Karamazov fares a little bit better, where there's much more of a plot going on. But it's still like a lot of boring philosophical stuff. But War and Peace, and I think Tolstoy in general, you don't get bogged down with this philosophy. His books are much more character-driven, which I think makes them a lot more readable and pleasurable than Dostoevsky. I mean, maybe if you're approaching this from like a literary merit point, maybe it's not as good as Dostoevsky if you're going to take that route. But just from like a readability standpoint, I think Tolstoy is much more readable. Now, the thing to keep in mind with War and Peace is it's a book where the plot moves very slowly. So you're just kind of, for most of the book, there's nothing happening. You're just kind of hanging out with the characters. But you're really getting to know the lives of these characters. So like, even though the plot is moving slowly, you're kind of eavesdropping on the conversations these characters are having. You're kind of following them around on their travels. And you don't get bogged down in any long descriptions of stuff. And you don't get bogged down in any kind of long philosophical digressions. It's just all about the daily lives of the characters and kind of what they're doing. So, like, I'm counting it as readable in that sense. The plot is moving slowly, but it's character-driven and it's conversation-driven. So if you just settle yourself in for that type of a ride, I think it can be actually fun and painless to read. But people disagree with me on this. I have friends who can't make it through War and Peace because they just kind of get to the middle and they're like, where is this going? This isn't going anywhere. But like, but if you approach the book with the mindset that it's not going to go anywhere for a while, then I think it can be all right. I don't know. It's borderline, so I'm counting it as borderline. And there is, fair warning, there is a, near the end, he does go off on a digression about his theory of history, but that's right near the end. And besides, I kind of thought Tolstoy's theory of history was interesting. I don't know, I'm a history buff. So it's about 100 pages out of like a book that's about 1,300 pages. A 100-page digression near the end where he goes off of his theory on history. So that does kind of break my theory that all of War and Peace is character-driven. There was that one digression. I didn't mind it. I don't know. Okay, next one. The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. Now, this again is kind of cheating because it's a philosophy book. And yeah, can I put a philosophy book on a list of books that are fun and painless? Maybe I can. Thomas Paine was famous back in his day for writing philosophy for the common people. You remember maybe from your history class that Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense and the Rights of Man. And these books were so popular at the time because they were so readable for ordinary people. Now they've aged a little bit because Thomas Paine was kind of writing in the 1790s. So, you know, with the writing style and stuff like that has gone out of fashion a little bit, but you read The Age of Reason, and it's still very readable. And he really packs his punches. The Age of Reason is where he's kind of, it's an anti-Christianity book. So kind of in this age of, it's not an atheism book, because Thomas Paine was a deist, but I think in this age of new atheism, where kind of Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins and stuff like that are on YouTube a lot. I'm 10 years out of date on this, I know. It was 10 years ago that all this stuff was popular. But still, you know, in the scope of history, kind of relatively close. It's really interesting, and if you like Hitchens, if you like kind of Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, and Hitchens' kind of new atheism, Hitchens stole all his best ideas from Thomas Paine. I was reading this book and I was like, oh, that's where Hitchens got that from. Oh, that's where Hitchens got that from. He just, you know, if you like Hitchens, this is like the original Hitchens, 200 years ago. Okay, and then the next one, the Iliad. Now, is the Iliad fun and painless? Certainly chapter 2 of the Iliad, where they list all the ships, is not fun and painless. But putting aside chapter 2, I don't know. I really liked the Iliad when I was a boy. It was just, I just loved the battle scenes. I don't know, this, I guess it's not the most edifying reason to like a book in kind of the civilized day and age of kind of modern civilization. But, you know, there's a 12-year-old boy in all of us who just kind of likes these. I read a prose translation of the Iliad. So you can find some prose translations which will read a lot more like a novel. Obviously, if you get the poetic translation, which tries to adhere as closely as possible to the original Greek poetry, that's not going to be painless to read. You know, it'll be good for you, I'm sure, but it won't be painless to read. But I had a prose translation of the Iliad, which was, I felt was kind of fun and easy to read. And, yeah, boy, there were parts of the Iliad which really just blew me away. I mean, the deeds of Diomedes, I just thought, you know, it starts off as like this big battle, but then it just gets crazier and crazier and crazier, and then the gods start fighting in the battle, and then Diomedes gets on the chariot with Athena driving it, and they go to fight against Ares, and then Aphrodite comes into the battle, and it just gets like, whew. I just thought, in terms of like describing this really epic battle between kind of gods and humans and like everything going on, I was just really into this as, you know, a seventh grader. The Odyssey was all right. I thought it was, you know, there's some really imaginative parts in the Odyssey, though it got a little bit episodic. And parts of the Odyssey kind of were a little bit slow. The Aeneid, you know, the one by Virgil. I know it has literary merit. I found it a little bit slow kind of reading it. Although the beginning of the Aeneid, sorry I'm pronouncing everything wrong. The beginning of Virgil with the sack of Troy is really good. But then I thought it kind of slowed down a bit in the middle. But yeah, Homer. Kind of cheating a little bit here. Oh yeah, the other thing about Homer is you can't just pick up Homer. You have to have some background knowledge of the Trojan War to make sense of this. A Greek audience would have known exactly what it was. You know, it's like watching a Superman movie or a Batman movie. You have to have kind of background knowledge of these characters. So I had first read The Trojan War by Olivia Coolidge, which is not a classic. It's a modern book, but it's very readable. Read that one first, and then pick up a prose translation of the Iliad. And if you kind of like ancient epic battles, I think it can be kind of fun. I'm cheating a little bit because that chapter 2 of the Iliad is a slog, no matter how you cut it. Chapter 2, they just list all the ships. But if you skip chapter 2, there are some slow parts later in the book as well. I don't know. Half count it. It half counts, maybe. Okay, so that's my list. Now, This might be interesting. I'm sure people will disagree with me on certain items on this list. I'm sure other people have their own ideas of classic books which are fun and painless to list. Maybe comment. Let me know what books you think are fun and painless. Let me know which books you disagree with me on. This could be like a fun discussion to get going. Okay, but I'm going to stop here.